All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Earth Central. Today's guest is the CEO and co founder of Cecil, Alex Logan. Cecil provides access to nature datasets globally. With Cecil, you can stay focused on developing data insights and leave the data acquisition and preparation to them. I'm glad to have you on the show, Alex. And we'll start by having a little bit of an intro of you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, and how you came to found Cecil.
Sure, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me along, Alex. I'm a co-founder and the CEO of Cecil. I've been working in technology for the last 10 years. I was born and raised in Sydney. That's where I started my career. I didn't have a very glamorous start to working in technology companies. My first job was packing boxes, or the first sort of 100 or 1,000 boxes for HelloFresh, and started my career in the ecosystem of startups in sort of 2010, 2011. At that point, I sort of grew into different roles and then spent some time at Boston Consulting Group, which is where I was working with multinationals. And at that point in time, a lot of those corporates were considering climate disclosures and looking at the risk that climate presented within their organization. And I started to think differently about what I wanted to do with my career. And fortunately, at the time, I was working with my co-founder, Rory, and we made the decision to take a leap out of probably well-paid and an enjoyable job to start our own company. And that was about 4 years ago. And we've been on a really exciting journey to fortunately be working with a lot of really great customers, a really great team for 4 years now. And that's led us to this point where we have the Cecil platform live. And I'll tell you a bit more about Cecil itself really soon.
Yeah, that's a perfect intro. So that actually gets us to the point that I wanted to hear, of course, which is Cecil's vision. What exactly Cecil does and what's the larger picture. Like, why are you doing this? Yeah, it sounds like to me, who has already had the pleasure of working with you a little bit, it sounds like a really cool mission. And I think you found a pretty important niche there. Yeah, I'm curious to hear it all in your words.
Yeah, for sure. So I think when we think about the future, there's a world in which we see that we both better understand, but also value nature. And I think that's a really important principle on the better understanding of nature that we see in the future. And there's still so much to learn about natural ecosystems, and there's a real importance, we believe, for continued understanding of nature. And also alongside that, we're now starting to see dynamics in the world where people are thinking about actually valuing nature very differently as well. So both those things are, I guess, principally what we see being required and being part of that future vision that we have for the world. And in any world where you better understand and value nature, that is going to have to be driven by data. So the types of experiences that we want to enable in the future are better research happening within academia, corporates and people that are working within organizations having access to data to make better decisions about their supply chains and nature risk. So again, when you think about those types of future experiences, having access to data becomes really important. So that leads us more to our mission, and that is to make that data really accessible for those types of experiences in the future. And today, I guess, a misconception that we hear is that, oh, we don't have the data, or we're not able to implement these strategies because the data doesn't exist. And for us, that's far from what the challenge actually is. We've been generating data on nature for a very, very long time, and we're getting better at that every single day. Whether you just simply look at Earth observation, we are generating petabytes of data all the time about natural ecosystems through technologies like remote sensing and increasingly new technologies to generate more data. So we fundamentally think that there is already enough data out there. And in fact, it is going to continue to proliferate. But one of the bigger challenges that is less spoken about is if there is so much data, the bigger problem may be that it's an accessibility challenge. And that's really what we focus on at Cecil, is solving that accessibility challenge. So when it comes down to, I guess, what does that mean, and what do we think those accessibility challenges are, we think about that in three categories. So the first is knowing what data set to use is really, really challenging. So if you're coming to having to do analysis on, let's say, a forest, maybe that forest is located in Africa, how do you know what data set to use for that particular ecosystem? You might be using an input data model that has been trained on data in a different part of the world. So how can you be sure that the allometric model that's being used to have those outputs for that forest data is going to work in your particular region? So amongst the thousands of data sets that exist, which one are you going to use? And we find that as a really common challenge that people have, spending months trying to search for the right data set to use for their analysis. A second sort of category, and we'll dive into each of these, I'm sure, throughout the podcast, is just the technical barriers that exist. For a long time, a lot of this data about natural ecosystems is spatially resolved, and therefore there have been ecosystems built around geospatial data that, to say it lightly, I guess, haven't been really necessarily built out for general public access. So we find that a lot of people, even if they can find the right data set, where do they get it from? What catalog should they use? What type of file format do they have to understand to get access to this data? So there's just technical barriers to it that exist too. And the final one is more on the commercial side. So even if you can find that data set and get access to it, what are the licenses related to it? And maybe you have to use multiple data sets. So you have to understand a lot of licensing, and there can be prohibitive pricing that exists where you have to pay upfront for a large amount of data, as opposed to just needing the maybe 300 hectares worth of data that you need to perform. So that gives you, I guess, an overview of where we see things going in the future, and what we believe is going to be important in a world in which we better understand and value nature, and bringing it back down to, what we think are some of the bigger challenges around accessibility that exist today and that are holding us back from that future.
There's also a big element to what you do that has to do with community building. And I know that there is this nature data sharing initiative. That's one element, but then there's also the product side. So do you want to elaborate a little bit on one of those two or both of them?
Yeah, so I think that thanks for bringing it up and allowing me to sort of speak about the two different hats that we try to wear at Cecil. And I think that there's a recognition at Cecil that this ecosystem around nature and nature data is still emerging and quite nascent. And therefore, we take on a responsibility to actually build up the community and try to at least believe that if we build up this community, we're going to benefit from it, or raise the tide is the way that we think about it. So there's one part of our business where we are committed to building resources and having initiatives that actually support other people in the community. An example of that is the Nature Data Sharing Initiative. And that is an initiative that contains resources that tries to break down a lot of the barriers and a lot of the knowledge gaps that come with sharing nature data. It actually all began when we had a customer, it was over 12 months ago now, that came to us and said that they'd actually sold some of the data that they had generated. And I was at first kind of shocked that someone was putting a price on nature data. So without revealing the team that we had been working with, they had been generating some in situ data. It was actually soil sampling data. and they'd been approached by a team that had been building a model for soil sampling, and they bought that data off that team. And when I asked them like how they shared the data and whether or not they had a contract in place, there was pretty boilerplate legal templates that were actually used around that. And again, I think that this showed examples of a real strong demand signal for nature data, but then a lack of resources for these teams that were getting asked those types of questions. So we took it upon ourselves, having seen a few more of those examples, to actually get a group together, which included indigenous advisors, legal, pro bono work that we were able to be supported by, and start to build out this collection of resources for people that were finding themselves in that situation. And in many cases, actually, indigenous communities are generating a lot of knowledge and information about our understanding of natural ecosystems, and are very under-resourced to understand what might be appropriate around how you may share that into the broader world of nature data. So we built out those resources. We released them about 3 or 4 months ago. They're very much version 0.1. And we are looking for people to continue to comment on them and see if they can use them in the ecosystem. So that's just one example of we put forward those resources. There are other people doing similar things. So Cascade Climate actually released the data quarry, which is a really nice initiative in the enhanced rock weathering ecosystem, which I see sort of almost as part of the nature data community. But another example was yesterday, we built off the back of a really cool resource of 575 forest carbon boundaries, forest carbon project boundaries that were released by Ilias and the Renosta team and a number of other academics in a paper about 12 months ago. And we put them onto an open map for people to also benefit from having them accessible and easy to download. So we sort of put ourselves out there a little bit on developing those resources, and essentially I guess it's recognition that this is a very early stage ecosystem, and we're going to need to build up different things ourselves, but also share that. And we feel that back from other people that are contributing as well. So that's one part of the business, but obviously we also have the core business. We are a private organization that has been building out a platform. So that's the main day-to-day business that we have. And within that, we have a Python SDK. So this product has been built specifically for data and science teams. And in the case of interacting with Orbify, it's the Earth observation team that interacts with the product. So there's no interface to Cecil, there's no UI, and that's designed in a specific way because we want to work with those technical teams who are embedding this into the product that they're developing. You can think of it a little bit as if you were to use an analog of the fintech industry, we are effectively Stripe for nature data. We sit behind, you can't see Cecil, you wouldn't know necessarily if you were interacting with data from Cecil, but we're building out much of that lower level technical infrastructure to make the lives easier for teams like Orbify that are building at that application layer and interacting with the market. So within that, we have the Python SDK, and then we have our API and our database access. So that's what we work on a day-to-day basis, and the things that people in using the product interact with.
That's super interesting to also understand a little bit better, like these two kind of pillars that you're standing on essentially. And it's funny because before we started the conversation, one of the questions that, of course, you write down, I would ask this pretty much anybody who comes on this podcast, but like, what makes Cecil stand out? And one of the things that is interesting to me is that it's such a collaborative model at the end of the day. So if I'm understanding it correctly, you have sort of identified a niche where being collaborative is the business model, essentially. I think, I mean, it's great. We have definitely benefited from that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment about how it's been able to integrate into Orbify. But before that, so you're talking about the community, like around nature data. And then you're talking about the product itself. This community aspect is super interesting because I feel like also on our side, where we're trying to create these software as a service solutions, which of course, just like us, so many similar companies, they have EO teams that hopefully you can help as well. And um, at the same time, I also always have the impression that, and this is part of why we have a podcast, because we see it not only as a competitive space, even in that, but like also a collaborative space, right? Like we're currently writing an article about the different solutions to EUDR regulation, for example, and so we're actually purposefully listing a lot of different companies because it's also obvious that in this space. There are like not one hat fits all, but there are all these different kind of services that are maybe best suited depending what your specific requirements are. Now, for me, it sounds like you've sort of turned this on its head, and you've seen that also for us, not every data set, or not only one data set fits the bill essentially. Can you talk a little bit about how, and this is also sort of how we're going to transition about how actually Orbify and Cecil ended up working together. How it facilitates, how it helps organizations like ours to integrate your data sets. Like, what is sort of like, what are their benefits other than and the fact that it saves them time, right? Like, what is the benefit essentially of doing this collaboration with you?
Yeah, well, I think that to answer that question, it probably helps to take a little bit of a step back and understand also why this is happening now, because I'm not sure that previously and historically necessarily these things have come together in a way that would make what we're building so valuable. So if we do take that step back and ask the question around why now, and why is it valuable to have something like Cecil almost as a middleware to teams like Orbify, we have to think about what's creating the dynamic for that to be required. And I think I've mentioned this a couple of times now, but there is a real proliferation of new data sources coming into the ecosystem. We're seeing new technologies being deployed for monitoring forests. We're seeing new technologies being deployed for biodiversity, and therefore the amount of data is becoming so large and from so many different sources that it's creating an environment whereby needing to join those data sets can become really challenging. And I think alongside that, we're also seeing real use cases for this data to get used. So recognizing that we're getting closer to that vision where large corporates and organizations are being asked questions and are asking questions themselves about nature, which is, yeah, increasing the need for applications that help answer those questions. EUDR, as an example, that you've mentioned. So with those types of market dynamics, we are seeing a stronger need for needing to join those data sets and sort of standardize the access to those data sets. And in the current state, with that amount of data and the amount of use cases that are coming downstream, we have a technical stack that exists right now that can create these challenges. So if you are forced with trying to get access to these data sets, you will need a way of processing a large amount of data. These are very large, like terabyte-sized files that are coming from satellite imagery and other data sources. So the heaviness on the infrastructure side can mean that if you do this yourself and build all the integrations, it's a huge investment.
Hmm.
I think in addition to that, you need really at times bespoke skills and systems that can be, require certain GIS skills that you may not have within your organization. In the case of Orbify, you're well supported with Earth observation scientists, but not everyone has those resources. And I think both of these things impact the usability of this data and can create challenges in answering those questions that need to get answered. And again, as we start to see more and more technology and more data generated, that's only going to exacerbate that challenge. So I think that when faced with that, you end up with a decision of do we go and build all of this ourselves and continue to build and maintain that, or can we come to a place like Cecil where it's going to, in fact, reduce that cost to get access, and it's going to reduce the time and effort to get access to that data, and therefore it becomes a really good opportunity for teams to come to us at this stage and start to use our Python SDK to get access to these data sets.
Super interesting. This is kind of I just wrote down cost, time, and effort basically before you mentioned them directly too, and it builds a little bit on a conversation, and this is purely coincidental that you speak after I talked to Carl Burkhardt. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's founded One Earth. Yeah, um, and we were discussing this, and this also kind of helps the layman audience understand this a little bit better too, including me, which is, the you said this early in this podcast already, I think earlier. The availability of data itself is not the issue anymore, which I guess if you would have, I don't know how you see this, but if you would have tried to create Cecil 10 years ago, I don't know if that would have, you know, I don't know how you see that, but would that even have been a feasible undertaking 10 years ago? I don't know.
Well, I think that we were still generating data at a scale that was probably challenging, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there maybe who are listening to this who were doing the hard work of integrating some of these data sets into a platform even 10 years ago. But I do think that there is a particular aspect of what is both what I mentioned before, the proliferation of this data and the generation of more data alongside a real need and the use cases that are emerging for people to understand and answer these questions. So I think that often it takes more than one lever for it to create a need so strong that exists right now. And I think that those two things, from a timing perspective, have come together. And to speak maybe more specifically about an example, things have changed from a technological perspective. We now have new satellites being deployed in greater volumes than ever before. And the technology, if we're looking at continuing that example of satellites, for hyperspectral, which is increasing the amount of data that is actually coming back from each of the satellites that are being deployed. So we definitely are, like, the numbers are there to suggest that there is a lot more data being generated, which exacerbates this problem, alongside some really great progress, in particular examples around policy and needing to answer these questions. But then also, I think, in a more unfortunate sense, there is just catastrophic events and uncertainty in the market around what is going to happen in the future. And therefore, people are really needing to get answers to questions a lot more immediately than they needed to in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we just going back to Carl, we were talking about this. Now that it really is, I think, something that he with his organization is struggling a lot with is how to actually use essentially the data that's there. And I think anything that can cut cost, time, and effort in order to actually just essentially get to work rather than prepare and access the data. I think is yeah you. It makes sense to me that there are a lot of thankful takers, and one of the things you were talking about, or that you mentioned, was your Python SDK. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so essentially, we wrap things in a Python SDK, and for those who are listening out there, that's one particular language that people use as part of their data analysis workflow. It's a very common, I guess, yeah, Python is widely used across the community. And we made that decision, yeah, as we went to market and based on the users that were coming to us for access. But the truth is, we also can support R. So our head of science loves using R, and there are many possibilities in the future for us to, I guess, play with that interaction with our platform. And the reason for mentioning that is that really what actually sits behind the Python SDK is what is important. And that API is meant to be really simple and easy to interact with. And that API allows you to create areas of interest. So for those who aren't familiar with that term, when you're looking to do analysis, maybe on, let's use an example, a agricultural property, you typically may be interested in that whole property boundary. And therefore, you would save that as a polygon, and that's what you would give to Cecil. And the reason that becomes important is rather than going and getting the entire global layer, it allows you to just get access to data for that particular property that you care about. So with the API, you can create those areas of interest and then make data requests from the different providers. Again, it's just a couple of lines of code to request that data from the providers, rather than having to build an entire integration to get access to that data. The final piece of the API, which again it's quite a specific niche thing, but it allows you also to have a reproject function, and that allows you to change the coordinate reference system on your the data that's been received from the providers, and up and down sample on the spatial resolution. So those are quite technical terms, but the reason, just to give a more practical example as to why we allow you to do that, is that the different data providers might deliver data on a different coordinate reference system and on a different spatial resolution. So having that functionality in the API actually allows you to line up all of the pixels onto the same grid so that you can join those data sets and compare the results from the different providers. So you may want to understand above ground biomass, and then you also want to take in some land use, land cover, and those classifications, and see the correlation between those two data sets. By using the API, you can not only get access to the data that you care about with your AOI, but you can also normalize that data and standardize that data so it's in a format that you can compare and join. So that's the API. And then on the other side is data access. So once we've gone through that process of requesting the data and it's been delivered, we make that available in a database. And again, it benefits from having that standardization where we've done that reprojection and it's all joinable and ready to use in your analysis workflow. So those are the two aspects of what sit actually behind the what is wrapped in the Python SDK. And typically what we see is that teams then want to introduce that into an application that they're building. So for example, we have a lot of teams that are building eligibility tools, and this is something that Orbify does as well. So you're allowing these data sets to be streamed into your eligibility tool as you have more properties and projects coming into that tool. So it starts to streamline the availability of that data into your workflows. We don't interface or have an interface for you to click around in, but the point is that you can integrate that into the interface that you're developing yourself.
Yeah, that's a nice segue because that's essentially what we needed, right? So one of the things, so Orbify essentially wanted to support clients with above ground biomass data sets, and again, searching for and identifying those data sets, and then building a pipeline, procuring licensing, and paying for the data. All this was made easier. um, yeah, can you walk us a little bit through, if we are Orbify, like how just using Orbify as a customer example, I guess, how you were helping.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, and I hope I do a good job of representing this, but Orbify is in one particular use case, they're doing a lot of things, but one of the tools that they have is a tool that supports teams who are at the early stages of developing an afforestation carbon project. And the interface that Orbify has is a really neat way for teams to come in and start doing eligibility and do due diligence on a potential area of interest for a carbon project. And they support those teams all the way through to monitoring after registration. So that's the interface. And to deliver on that experience for their customers, introducing data sets that can support the development of a PDD or a monitoring report is really important. So being able to have and expand the data sets that are available to those teams that are using the application that Orbify has developed is something that they'll constantly need to do, because there might be projects in different parts of the world that don't and are not supported by existing data sets. There might be particular variables that become important to particular customers. So having a strong catalog of data sets that Orbify can access is really important to supporting that customer experience. And as you mentioned, Alex, in a world without Cecil, if you wanted to rapidly expand that catalog of data sets that you're making available through your platform, you would have to do curation of those data sets, understand where they perform well, what variables they come with. So that work goes away with Cecil, because we've brought all that information into one place and streamlines your understanding of when a data set might be useful and where a data set might be useful. It also takes away the technical integration. So having to do integrations with multiple data catalogs and multiple data providers is not required anymore. You have that unified access through Cecil. And then finally, on the commercial side, yeah, we've done the work to actually partner with these providers. We are licensed resellers of the data. And in that way, it allows us to actually have one contract with Cecil, but benefit from all the contracts that we've developed with those providers. So you don't have to spend as much time negotiating with those providers, understanding the end user license agreements. We've done that work. We've got a relationship with them, and we can pass through that data for you to use in your use cases. So that gives you a bit of a deeper understanding of some of the challenges that were faced by Orbify in trying to expand those data sets that they could make available to their customers. And now, with the integration set up, all it takes is submitting an AOI and the data request ID, and then we respond with the data back, and that can be used in the application that Orbify is developing.
Yeah, you did a really good job at representing what we do there. And of course, your side, but I think that one you are familiar with. um, and yeah, I can only say it is really true when we had Michal integrate some of the data sets. He sent me some of the outputs, and he also he confirmed it. We went from integrating these data sets or onboarding to integrating in just days. And yeah, it could take months otherwise, essentially, to do that. So it is super useful. And there is something I want to ask you, and I'm not sure how. I mean, there's data on everything, so I'm just gonna try to ask anyway, because I would be curious. It's something that I talked to Carl about, and it's something that comes up, and maybe because you mentioned, I think, really, really briefly in the beginning. So, for example, one of the things we're building, or we have a carbon ARR project, carbon platform, essentially, right? And this template that we're using, one of the things that it does is it assesses indigenous lands and nature reserves, essentially. Now, from the communication I've had with Carl about, in the podcast, one of the things that he's like seeking is like more data sets related to indigenous lands. Are you familiar, or is this something that has already come up in your journey as well? That there's kind of a demand and maybe also a shortness in supply still.
I think that there's two hats that I can put on for this answer. I think again, going back to the community building hat and the work that we've done with the Nature Data Sharing Initiative, and then more of the product hat in working at Cecil. And I'll maybe just answer on the product hat to start with, and how we think about expanding data sets. So we like to describe it as taking a scientific approach to bringing data sets onto the platform. And this is really led out by our head of science, Tom, and the science team that he's built at Cecil. And what that means is that we look at different scientific concepts, and then we look to build out data sets as part of them. So our first scientific concept was plant biomass. And the neat thing about that is when you think about plant biomass, there are ways in which you can observe plant biomass with variables. So canopy cover, canopy heights, total biomass. And then you can go and look for data sets that support those variables. We've now expanded into land use and land cover. And we're bringing on data providers that support different classifications within land use and land cover. So the approach that we take there in sort of a scientific approach, thinking about each concept and how that relates to an ecosystem, and then supporting data sets on an ongoing basis to expand into more data sets. So that's just a shorter answer on the product side. I think in any case, no matter where we operate and in what data sets we operate, and this is me sort of switching to the NDSI side of things, we see a lot of the time really valuable data being generated with communities, and in particular indigenous communities. And the challenge here is obviously from one perspective, just the resourcing side of things and the capability building that may still need to occur for what is already and has been being generated for a very, very long time to be well represented of these ecosystems that are managed by indigenous communities. So I think there are a lot of initiatives going on at the moment to enable these communities with better technology and better resources to be able to capture that knowledge that has been developed for thousands of years on these particular ecosystems. So there's one challenge that exists around that. And I think from the NDSI perspective, it then becomes a responsibility of ensuring that we are enabling these indigenous communities to actually have fair sharing of this data set, and quite frankly, a decision and control of whether or not that data gets shared at all. So as part of the resources that we've developed, we try to both enable people if they want to go down the path of sharing this data. There's really rich and important data that needs to be generated, that needs to potentially be used. Then they can go down a path of doing that with the resources that support them to be properly compensated for that if that's the path that they want to take down, or to ensure that that data is going to be used responsibly in some sort of downstream analysis. So again, there's another lens to this, which is historically we haven't done a great job of enabling these indigenous communities with the right resources, and at times it's probably fair to say that the abuse of that knowledge has been prevalent, and therefore there are risks associated with even finding the right ways in which that knowledge and information can be shared. We go into a lot more depth in that, and I would encourage people who are interested in this topic to read through the Nature Data Sharing Initiative, because that is a place in which we consulted some indigenous advisors to help us with those resources. And that's a really good place to understand some of these common challenges that exist. I guess coming back now to your question, though, notwithstanding, if we're able to overcome some of those barriers and some of those risks associated with sharing this information, it is obviously a place in which there is rich knowledge and information to be shared to better push ahead our understanding and valuing of nature. So I think probably, and I'm not familiar exactly with where you landed on this with Carl, but those are probably some of the underlying reasons as to why there are those challenges in getting access to that type of data.
Yeah, it stems from that conversation because I think he sees it as a really, really critical part, rightfully so, to proper conservation work. I mean, he comes more from the direct conservation world, and in our case, when we develop a product, it is also what the regulation requires, right? So for you to have a additional a carbon project that's considered additional, then technically it needs to be not built in any way or carried out on indigenous lands, essentially. And there is some interesting conversation in that too that Carl went into, but that's where he's a lot more of an expert in there than I am. And you were also talking about sort of the kinds of data sets that you focused on in the beginning and how you're growing, and of course one of the really big ones is above ground biomass. The interesting thing is what that automatically triggers in my head, and something that I think is becoming hugely important, is data on soil. And I don't know if you see it in your near future that soil data sets also become something that is part of your platform.
Yeah, it's our head of science has a background in soil, so he definitely has his particular views on this type of thing, and he's quite open about that. I think that maybe to answer it in a slightly broader way and then apply that to soil. Ultimately, what we're looking for when we're thinking about our roadmap of data sets is where we can get really high confidence in the maturity of the technology and ultimately the accuracy and some sort of evaluation of that technology and its performance, and combining that with tangible use cases that are going to be helpful and the scientific knowledge that exists around those use cases. And there's a lot of people working really, really hard on soil. I think that there are a lot of challenges with that type of, category of data. And I think there's amazing work going into that, and there are some incredible teams that are working on that. But at the moment, it's still, challenging to think about a global version of soil data, a global map, knowing that between one sample right next to each other, you can get very different profiles. So I think that it's definitely something we hear a lot about, and there's probably a demand signal that we see from the market around that type of data. And there are also some incredible teams such as Perennial released a really exciting soil map just recently in probably the last couple of weeks. So we're seeing those advancements coming. But at the moment, it's quite difficult to see how we would integrate that necessarily with the confidence that we want to have around the the maturity of the technology and the types of results that we could get back. So I think that's where we're at in a journey, knowing and recognizing that there's a lot of demand for that, and then finding to combine that with some confidence around the technologies and what we could offer to those teams. So it's an interesting space for that reason, because as you say, there's a ton of demand, but we're still seeing those technologies getting and maturing to a point where it can be sort of scaled out and accessed by a lot of people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I also think it is, like as you're saying, this is a very difficult space to get like reliable data sets on a global scale. I remember people creating, and the previous employer that I worked for was part of this. They were creating a global soil, or at a sort of a soil map for Africa. And I think even with tens of thousands of samples and machine learning, still I think they themselves recognized, right, like that they had very, very good resolution on the one hand, but it's just a matter of soil composition and the way it varies, which I think is remains with this map to this day a really big challenge. I don't think I'm saying anything that will take anybody off by just acknowledging that. So that makes me wonder though, on the other hand, and if you're willing to say, where do you see, like, what your next gap, right? Like, what sort of data sets, what's something that you feel like that you see coming down the line that Cecil would like to focus on next, or integrate next?
Yeah, so I think that, and just to add to your point that you made, there are still huge uncertainties and challenges also with even above ground biomass. So I think there's a strong recognition that a lot of these data inputs are estimates, and they should be treated in that way. And ultimately, the introduction of more ground truthing, and there's still advancements that need to come even for above ground biomass in a woody biomass context. And as you say, I don't think that anyone listening to this would disagree with that. And everyone is kind of on this journey, this continuous improvement journey. But to take that question that you've asked me now, I would say that we are seeing, only to make things maybe even more challenging again, a lot of requests coming in to understand biodiversity. And I mean, how do you even define that in and of itself is a real challenge. So I think that's something that we're seeing from the market. And there are obviously data sets that exist at the moment that are being widely used, like the IBAT data sets that we're thinking about, and looking at the moment. But also there's a whole lot of new technologies that are being deployed to understand the very complex topic of biodiversity. So I think that, again, we're trying to apply a really pragmatic approach to going on the journey of supporting the market demand around that. And our first foray into that is to looking at land use and land cover, habitat classification, habitat intactness. Those are some of the questions that people are asking. So I think that there's a huge emergence of demand around biodiversity, and again, only making things even more complex for ourselves by sort of venturing into that, but finding that we're making some good progress in balancing what is a very difficult and complex topic with some practicalities, and really excited about some of the technologies that are being developed to help in that space.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. Biodiversity, I think, and again, this is such a comprehensive, or complex issue. Even if you had super representative data sets for individual elements of it, there's just so much to biodiversity that I see the big challenge there. I'm actually gonna send you later an article I wrote, a few years ago. The data set that I was thinking of now, as you're giving that answer, that was built with the predicts dataset from the Natural History Museum in London. And so it was Impact Observatory that published a map at the time. And they're called biodiversity intactness
Mm.
data sets. So so to sort of show how intact, is the biodiversity pretty much on any spot on planet Earth. And we wrote back then. We wrote sort of my previous employer. We wrote sort of a an article to demonstrate the use case of these kind of data sets for very very different environmental challenges like urbanization. We use like urbanization in Kigali in Rwanda, and restoration in a reserve in Madagascar, and agriculture in Argentina, right? And it's but it also made me realize, um, it's worth something. But I think exactly this is where again a service like Cecil comes in. If there's a plethora of high quality data sets together, by being able to integrate them together, and putting them together, I think you're going to get so much more valuable information on these questions. So yeah, I see the big challenge, but also a challenge is also a nice challenge to have, a nice thing to work on. I see how that would be a super rewarding and super challenging endeavor. um, yeah, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that point, or
Yeah, I think maybe one thing that comes to mind is something that we see as a real emerging opportunity for us. So to date, we've had plant biomass data sets mostly on the platform, and historically, a lot of those products come with quite common temporal frequency. So they come with either an annual or a quarterly temporal frequency. And therefore, I guess from a joining of data sets, a lot of the time it's quite easy to join them by year. But now we're seeing the emergence of a lot of these products coming into our platform as well that potentially have much higher frequency of data. So an example of that would be the land use and land cover product from WRI and Google, Dynamic World. It has it's based off Sentinel-2, and therefore has a frequency of every 2 to 5 days. And so I think, just to add another dimension, and one that we haven't spoken as much about on this call yet, but actually knowing what time period to use when you're doing your analysis, when you're getting data that frequently, and you're looking at joining that with a data set that has a different temporal frequency, can become really, really challenging. So we see, a big opportunity for us, in addition to the CRS work that we do, so allowing you to control the coordinate reference system, but also the resampling of the spatial resolution. A big emerging opportunity, particularly with some of these data sets that are coming onto the platform, to actually enable a much nicer experience around being able to, have a temporal frequency, or get the data for the time period that you really want. And I think that there are many use cases that come up around change detection, of which this will become really important. So we're excited about, starting to get to work on not just new data sets onto the platform, but also some of this additional functionality that hopefully will take away a lot of that hard work of having to look back at the different sort of time series analysis and see which lines up with another data set.
what would you say in this space, for Cecil, but also in general, as things are going? We've already addressed that it's not data availability anymore that's the issue; it's accessibility. We've talked about the focus on the commercial, technical, community building, and we've talked about effort, cost, and time efficiency. Right? What do you think? These are like, we're talking about the solutions and the positives. What do you think now in your position, right? Like you're seeing this, you've identified a great niche, you're providing solutions. what do you think are sort of the biggest challenges coming up? Do you see any specific ones, I guess, first of all, or is it just, it could also be that you see it like it's turning into an easier situation, or I don't know. Elaborate, please.
Yeah, so I think we've touched on something that's changed recently a couple of times, and you made the point around would Cecil have been required 10 years ago, and I think it would have benefited some people, but I think that based on if we continue to see this trend where we have an increase in the generation of data to the types of scale that we're seeing and a continuation of that scale of data generated, plus hearing from more people on the market side from a demand perspective that they're wanting to ask questions about natural ecosystems and get answers to that, then I think that we'll only see a continuation of the inflection point of these challenges that we've discussed on the call today. So I think you need to believe in those two essentially assumptions, that we're going to see more data and that we're going to have more questions being asked. And if you extrapolate that out, then that's going to intensify the need for better access to these types of data. And I think that what that means is that on both sides of the coin of selfishly talking a little bit about Cecil and Bert Orbify here, I think that we're going to have a new technology stack that I think is already emerging, but we are going to have a new technology stack that supports this future state. And I think that that involves both on the more lower level technical side of things, solving for some of these technology challenges, even in the scientific aspect of soil or biodiversity, but then also just the infrastructure that needs to exist for all this data to get cleaned and be maintained and be ready for use. And that's sort of on the side of what Cecil needs to solve for. So I think we're only going to see new challenges emerge. An example of that being the joining of data sets that have different temporal frequencies. We're going to have to see more people solving for those types of challenges. So I think at the lower level and the infrastructure level, there's going to be pressure applied to existing systems, and we're going to need to create new systems to solve for those new challenges that emerge. And I think probably on the Orbify side of things, even if we achieve all of those very neat technical solutions, I still think there's going to be a role for interpretation. And at that application layer, as the way that I like to describe it, that application layer, we're going to need to have better ways of communicating and inferring what is actually happening within a specific context for a user who is potentially not very technical. So I think, again, we need to solve on both sides of the technology stack. Being able to solve for these deeper, more fundamental problems of the challenges that new data sets and new technologies will create, but then also continuing to have teams that are working through the interpretation of those questions that people are going to ask. So yeah, I think I see, selfishly a lot of opportunity that's going to come if we continue to believe that those assumptions are true around the generation of more data and the reason for having more questions about natural ecosystems. With more data being generated and thinking about the technology stack that needs to exist there, you'll need to have ways in which you are both enabling the processing a lot of that data, but then also the joining of that data. There are a lot of deeper infrastructure challenges that will exist in a future where you have a lot more data and you have new technologies generating that data. And that's really where I see the challenge that we have to work on at Cecil, but also other people to work alongside of us. And I think that at the same time, beyond just the technical challenges that will exist at that lower level infrastructure side of things, we also have, and this is where I see sort of applications like Orbify playing such a crucial role, is that with more questions and more technologies, the inference of that and the communication of that to an end user, of someone who is maybe of less technical capability to answer that question, we're going to need that application layer and that inference layer to continuously get developed and updated and be in sync with the questions that are getting asked and the new data that is being generated. So I think that if you look at what that presents, is I can see the signs of it today, with teams like Cecil and Orbify collaborating. But I think we need to take it we will need to really step it up. And there's still so many challenges to continuously get solved for. So I see new companies getting created and consolidation and standardization happening between these organizations that will help us get to that future where people are able to answer the questions they need to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think this is one of the big debates also, or one of the big points in the open source world, right? Like the one thing is enabling everybody with access. The other way is the knowledge to use whatever you can with the access. And again, it's definitely what you're working towards in a way, but I think like with the more information comes also the more need for broader technical knowledge, I guess. So that's the super fascinating conversation that we can discuss maybe on another as a main topic, if you ever would like to, on a different call. That's like one of the things where I would love to invite a few experts,
Hmm.
to have a conversation on that, because that's really been with me, and I've been working in this geospatial sustainability sector for a while now, for different organizations and companies, different levels, and this point keeps on coming back, I feel like. Is there anything that you feel like you would like to add to any of the points that we've discussed, or anything else that you would like to bring up?
I think there's potentially a point around what you mentioned on open source. And again, as we've talked about in this call, I have a deep, strong feeling that, in fact, the community building and the effort that we need to put into the ecosystem is really, really important. And sometimes I get a bit of a question around that as to how can you do that whilst also sort of building the company. And I think it comes down to ways in which we're thinking about it, to be smart about how we leverage other resources and can be effective. So to give people a bit of a thought around, like, you still have to put in a lot of work. Like, we put in a lot of work to build out the nature data sharing initiative, but we collaborated with a law firm to actually build out the agreements that exist within those resources. And we also worked with Indigenous advisors to gather knowledge and information from them. And we still had to put the work in to bring it all together, but we picked up on different and were resourceful about how we did that. And I think that everyone got a benefit out of it. Another example of that would be, as you mentioned, you've been at the intersection of sustainability and geospatial for some time. And I think a lot of this data and a lot of what we're doing and what we're working through is geospatial by default. And therefore, the investment that has gone into other sectors that are leveraging geospatial can actually be brought across into the very specific niche that we work in. So I like to engage and feel as though I benefit a lot from some of the broader geospatial communities and the things that they're open sourcing in industries and domains that are probably more mature than nature. So I would encourage people who are thinking about, like, the way in which we need to build ecosystems and communities around nature data to look to things like cloud native geospatial, which is a sort of industry effort that Radiant Earth is supporting, where there's philanthropic funds and there's a lot of effort that goes into building out frameworks and standardization. And immediately at first, you don't necessarily think about them being someone who would be helping nature data within this very small niche that we kind of work in, but you can actually get a lot of benefit out of that. So I think for people who are listening to this, who thinking about, well, how do we balance open source? How do we balance also building the businesses that need to get built? I think we need to be really resourceful around how we do that. Collaboration being one of those things, but also just looking for other places where you can bring that knowledge back into this emerging ecosystem.
Cool. Is there anything else that you feel like we've missed or brushed over?
I don't think so. I think it's been a good conversation, and I would just say that maybe on the again the it would be wrong for me not to say this on the call, but the types of teams that we typically work with, for those who are listening, and through the example, I think you've been very kind in sharing some of the experiences of Orbify. But if you look at the team within Orbify that are interacting with Cecil, it is teams and individuals that have Earth observation backgrounds, or more of that technology and software engineering background. So for those who are listening that have felt that pain of having to build integrations with different providers, or navigate the challenges of wanting to expand the data sets on a platform, yeah, I would love to have a conversation, and be able to see if we could help out, because that's the stuff that we love doing. And even if there's not a data set on there today that you really need, that's a big focus for us, is to understand what data sets we should be bringing onto the platform, so that we can continue to help more teams with the way in which we do with teams like Orbify. So if there's someone listening, feel free to please get in touch, and would love to have a discussion. I mean, there's also the angle that if you are a data provider and you think that you could benefit from distributing some of that data more easily to a team, and a network of teams that we have on our platform, we'd be very open to that conversation.
Awesome. This will I'll make sure to put this out as a clip too, and of course our people will listen to it. I always push them to. And I know that our EO team loves to listen to the podcast. They at least they tell me so. And yeah, and then with that, I think it's only fair what I usually like to ask of our guests, and I'm also curious from you. The final question usually is, what are you proudest of what you have achieved with Cecil? Or you can also ask, you can also answer something else.
Yeah, I think that what is really unique, and actually in some ways I've become a little bit numb to this feeling, because in my career I've had the great fortune of being really early at a couple of companies. But I think that when you launch a product and you have teams using it, that is a really special experience. And I've been fortunate again in my career to do that a few times from the earliest stages. But I think that for me, being able to do that and work with the teams that we work with, that is the most special thing, and it's really unique. You can spend your whole career in software and technology, or even in sustainability, but have that moment when you launch the product, and then to have teams interacting with that product and using that product to build applications like what Orbify is building. I think that that's something that no matter what sort of is lays ahead of us in the future, you can't really take that away from the team at Cecil, and what we've been able to build. So I think I often remind my team that that is a really special thing to be able to launch a product and have people use that. And yeah, 100% the work that went into building out this platform and having it used by teams is certainly the thing that I'm most proud of.
Awesome. That's super nice to hear. And yeah, I'm hoping that, again, this isn't going to be the last conversation we have. I think I've also really enjoyed it. If you're interested, as you know, there's the conversation with Carl. That was actually the first podcast that I hosted um, for this Earth Central podcast. So you're guest number two for me personally. And the next one that might also be interesting to you is hopefully, if it works out with his schedule, is with Matt Forrest, and it's about one of the things we will be touching on at least is the future of GIS. And yeah, he seems like a perfect person to talk about that with. So since we've been talking about the future in this conversation quite a bit, maybe it's interesting for you to listen into as well.
Yeah, I'm a big follower of the work that Matt does, and I think also, yeah, we know Carl really well. I think that there could definitely be an interesting conversation with our head of science, Tom
Mhm.
Walker, and then someone in a similar vein to Carl, talking about yeah, where things are going around these nature markets and some of the technology advancements that are coming. So yeah, it's kind of nice to be wedged in between those two people because I think it blends the two worlds. On one side, the new stack around geospatial that's being developed, and then on the other side, also understanding, particularly within nature markets, what we can expect in the future.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's a nice sequence we have going. So yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time for everything, also for our collaboration. For everybody who's interested in this, we will also provide the link to the press release that shows the partnership between Cecil and Orbify as well that Alex and I actually worked on together. And with that, I wish you a wonderful, well, you're like basically midday now over there in New York, so you have a lot of day to go. At that time, I was today enjoying the sun here in Sweden, which is still up, but you know it's much more special here. So, um, yeah, I really appreciate the conversation and thanks so much for your time.
No, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me. And yeah, I look forward to speaking again in the future.